Political compass test, if you went way back in my Twitter feed a couple years ago, you would find me saying something like, you didn't want to engage the modern era politically without at least running through the political compass test, because it adds a dimensionality to the ability to understand people's political position that isn't there in the classic right-left dimension. So if you imagine a system of two axes. The left-right axis is the same as normal, political left and political right, but there's a second axis, the vertical axis, that goes from libertarian in the bottom up to authoritarian in the top. And the idea is that this gives you four quadrants that describe different sorts of political ideologies, right? So
it's a small L libertarian. This is not a map for the big L libertarian political party that we have in the United States, for instance.
Yes, and in fact, if you look on my Wikipedia page, you will see that I am quoted as describing myself as a left libertarian, which is sort of a head scratcher if you think of it as big L libertarian, but it is, of course, little L libertarian, which means very liberty focused, as opposed to trying to dictate how things ought to be.
One way I've heard it described is the libertarian versus authoritarian axis, is that those near the authoritarian end prefer to use power to accomplish their goals, and those closer to the libertarian end prefer to use reason or perhaps gentler forms of coercion. So, given that, you might imagine that politicians, people who have decided that they want to be in a position of power, would lean towards the authoritarian end of the axis simply because they have chosen to be in a position in which they hope to exert some control, in many cases to try to do good, but that power is inherently part of the job description.
Well, I want to back us up just slightly, because my sense is that it's not that libertarians like me and you,
small L
libertarians, want to use gentler forms of coercion. I believe the bias, really, if you chase down what we actually believe, it's we want to minimize the coercion necessary to accomplish the objective.
Which is why the power versus reason description seems just too much in favor of the libertarian end for me to say it without any qualifying words at all, because it seems like that must be my bias showing. But I think it is pretty accurate, frankly.
Well, let me. I think where it goes would be something like this. For me, at least, I will say the mechanisms I favor most to accomplish an objective, like leveling a playing field, would be incentives that allow the market to solve problems, right? Now, I'm not a market fundamentalist. I don't believe that the market inherently solves all of our problems if we just give it leeway. I actually think we need to very carefully think about what incentives to place. But once we've placed those incentives, market mechanisms allow people essentially to discover whether they are on the right track by whether or not it rewards them. Again, this is not the system we have. Lots of people get paid for doing terrible things to society, and that shouldn't be. But a system of proper incentives would be a very gentle way to get society to function better than it does.
Yes. So the people who made the political compass test decades ago at this point have taken a lot of flack for it, and have also responded almost entirely, as far as I can tell, with careful, nuanced discussion of what it is that they're doing. So you can go online and take the test yourself, and it will plot you on this graph of two axes, and then it will also show you who among historical figures, both past and present, you are like and unlike. And I, for reasons of a little bit more diving deep into the final chapter of our book, I went back and took it again recently this week, and was noodling around on their site and found some of these charts that they have in which they have plotted current political figures on. So before we show this, so this is we're going to show a graph, the political compass test graph of their estimations of where the candidates for president in 2020 in the United States show up on the graph, all of them, not just the two major party candidates, but all the Democrats who are running, the Republicans, the Green, and the libertarian. So how do they get to these? Do they get these politicians to take these tests? No, and maybe some of them do, but their position is, and I'll just read here from their site. You don't have to show this, Zach. On their FAQs page, how can you determine where politicians are honestly at without asking them? And before I even read their answer, I would say, as an animal behaviorist, I used to joke, "Oh, wouldn't it be easier if we could just interview the bees or the beavers or the parakeets?" Like, no, actually, because they'd lie.
Yeah, it'd be way
Would politicians lie? Of course they would. Of course they would. So what they say here is, how can you tell where they're honestly at by asking them? Especially around election time. We rely on reports, parliamentary voting records, manifestos, and actions that speak much louder than words. It takes us a great deal longer than simply having the politician take the test, but it's also a far more accurate assessment. Okay, so they go on a bit, but given that, let us show, Zach, the Political Compass Test's estimation of where, in 2020, the U.S. candidates for president fall on their graph. Left is left, right is right, top is authoritarian, bottom is libertarian. Oof, right? Almost everyone who was running for president in the United States this year shows up in the authoritarian right. Trump, of course. Pence, of course. Biden, yeah. Not really that much farther left than Trump, and only a couple squares down in the authoritarian axis. Harris, similar position to Biden as Biden is to Trump. Almost everyone else. The big exceptions, I was so pleased to see this, Tulsi Gabbard, and then we have Hawkins as the Green candidate over in the left libertarian camp, and Joe Jorgensen, who's the libertarian candidate for president, far right in libertarian camp, and Sanders and Gravel also in left libertarian.
So I want to point out a couple of things here. I have to say I both do and don't buy this graph.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason is that I am afraid that what we are seeing is downstream of the effect of a giant magnetic force.
Yeah.
And
that wouldn't mean that this was untrue. It would just mean that these characters don't necessarily have the agency that they pretend they do or think they do.
Well, I think it means two things, and one of them is consistent with the interpretation presented, and one of them isn't.
Okay.
So if you imagine a system that will only accept answers that don't upend what it finds sacred, right, then it will essentially filter the world of potential candidates for only those that are consistent, and therefore you will get this amazing bias. It's not like people...
You want Zach to be showing this?
Yeah, Zach, would you put it back up? So all of these candidates in the upper right-hand quadrant are effectively in the upper right-hand quadrant after we know of them and after they have ascended to a point of seriousness in these races. Mm-hmm. And so in some sense, that is, you are seeing the validation of the duopoly there. And it is not surprising that the duopoly favors authoritarian measures and is far right leaning, right? Yeah. That's its bias. So on the one hand, this is a filter of individuals. That part would correctly reflect their position here. But then the other part, which is going to be very hard to disentangle from this, is that their tendency to say things that allow them to move into the next round, to live to fight another day politically, means that they may not tell us what they really think. Is Bernie Sanders really that close to the actual center? By some measures, yes.
Well, but this is why, that's why I read part of their answer to the question about how it is that they place the politicians that they do on these graphs where they do, which is that they use actions whenever they can, voting records and such, right? So not just words, but if it's words, it's words that have something demonstrating skin in the game behind them.
Right. So the real question I think people should be asking themselves is, if you take this test and you don't come out in that upper right-hand quadrant, and then you imagine, well, were I to enter the political landscape, how far in that direction would I find myself moved? Mm-hmm. That's a really important question. And the fact that you would find yourself moved at all is really the hidden message here, right? The fact that our system just simply refuses to accept anything of a different type, right? That it systematically marginalizes things in the lower left-hand quadrant, for
And the
example.
lower right.
Yeah, I would say it does, though there is a, well, no, I guess it does systematically marginalize both differently.
And, according to this, we have no one in the upper left. Now, you and I would argue, and I think that most people would argue, given the description of what this is trying to describe, that we should be minimizing anyone in the upper half of this at all. So when I say there's no one here in the upper left, it's not that I wish that there was. It's that I wish that there, all of those people in the upper right quadrant were down in the lower half. And frankly, if they were all in the lower right, we would have a much more fair and just world, even though you and I are both pretty far over left in that lower left quadrant.
Yeah. I would agree. And one of the critiques that has been leveled is that nobody will place themselves in the upper part of this graph.
Sure.
Right now, they will accidentally by answering the questions honestly, but there's something stigmatizing about the label authoritarian, whereas libertarian, small l at least, is not stigmatizing.
Yep.
But I will also say, in some sense, the upper left-hand quadrant is in the street, rebelling in a very frightening way. But wokeness is unrepresented on this graph with respect to modern politicians, though many have paid lip service to it. And so there's a question about, I also
We've
wanted
got Mao and Stalin and Che Guevara and such in the upper left historically.
Right. Oh, historically, yes. Yeah. Modern times, no. And, we're seeing a resurgence of this, which is frightening, right, because of where all of those examples point. But the other thing I wanted to point out, and I wish we had this paper, but a couple years back, there was a paper that suggested that authoritarianism was actually a personality type, and that many of those that we find on the authoritarian left actually would be just as happy on the authoritarian right if the winds were blowing the other way.
Well, we talked about one piece of research that came out a number of episodes ago that was not from a couple years ago, but more recent. We specifically talked about such a piece of research.
It's possible I'm misremembering when it came out, but in any case, it is worth considering where you would find yourself in the absence of these other influences. What motivates you to be there? In other words, there's a lot of self-serving economic conservatism in the upper right-hand quadrant, whereas ideological economic conservatives often find themselves in the lower right-hand quadrant. In other words, it's an actual belief that if we just simply clear the decks of obstacles, people will find their way to success and it fixes problems.
Yeah.
And it's not that there's no truth in that, but it's far from a complete solution as you and I would see it.
Now, this is verificationist, I think, but I find it interesting that the characters that I have the most strong visceral reaction to are very far over right, and the two that strike me particularly, even farther right than Trump on here, are Bloomberg and Inslee. And Bloomberg, I think every American watching at least will recognize who he is. And at the point that he started running late in the game, before it looked like Biden was the heir apparent, I said to you, I cannot believe that there's some chance the Democrats are going to elect, are going to nominate this guy. He is so not on the left. But Inslee, who ran briefly, is the governor of Washington State and pretends to be interested in the climate. That's his issue. And so it would seem like, good environmentally interested people like us would be in support of him, but he is at best a stuffed shirt and at worst a completely corrupt, frankly, caricature of a politician. He's inept.
Yeah. In some ways he is the same level of emptiness of Joe Biden, but he's accomplished it without the senility, which is quite something.